Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to be returning to Monkey with the Eldar Exodites, space elf Amish people who elected to leave the crumbling Eldar Empire before it, burst into being a chaos god. So, on this particular occasion, being an Amish turned out to be the 100% correct choice. Plus, if you sign up to the Eldar Luddite lifestyle now, you'll get your very own pet Brontosaurus to own, to pet, and ride into battle. Because, well, who doesn't love a dinosaur with laser cannons? But first, a word from our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, the world's best dungeon-delving strategy game with over 80 million downloads. That's a lot of players taking on bosses, fighting PvP battles, and getting immersed in the world of Teleria. And so today, here are the top 4 raid reasons to play the game. The raiding, of course. With 2 clan bosses, 12 dungeons, the Doom Tower, and a 12 chapters long campaign, there is always something to do in raid. There is always more gear, experience, or resources to be gathered from the bountiful dungeons below. A. Arena. The PvP arena, to be precise. Or arenas, as there is 2, both a team v team and a multi-team arena, where you can work your way through the leagues and win prizes every week. Investment. I'm not gonna lie to you, like all free-to-play titles, Raid requires an investment of time. But once your first few teams are up and running, there is no resource you cannot earn for 100% free. Even sacred shards for the chance to get a legendary champion can be obtained by beating the Demon Lord. And speaking of the devil, D for Demon Lord. One of the big tiered challenges in Raid are the 2 clan bosses, with the Demon Lord having 6 different difficulty levels with ever-increasing daily rewards for bringing them low. And who doesn't like stacking up millions of damage? And whilst on the topic of rewards, Raid is currently having its 4th anniversary event, with massive celebrations, free gifts, promo codes, events, and the opportunity to get brand new anniversary champions. For current players, there is also a snazzy recap video celebrating your greatest achievements in Raid. And for Amazon Prime members who just got the Gembo, the Dishonored Champion, there are new drops available made up of powerful Savage gear. And, as always, for new players of Raid, if you sign up now using the link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen, you will get this cool in-game loot and get in just in time for the enormous 4th anniversary celebrations. All of these rewards will be available right here in your inbox. And now, on with the lore. So, why do the Eldar Exodites even exist? Well, the most immediate and obvious reason is, again, because dinosaurs with laser cannons are pretty goddamn cool. And back in the day, Games Workshop agreed with this sentiment. And so they were first hinted at and talked about in, I believe, White Dwarf back in the 1990s, and then officially introduced, quote-unquote, in the 2nd Eldar Codex, if my memory isn't completely screwing me over at the moment anyways, after which they haven't really been touched upon all that often. They've been alluded to here and there, mentioned, and some artwork of them have been created. Some goddamn awesome artwork, honestly. I mean, look at this one. This is a brilliant, good old-fashioned piece of Warhammer 40k artwork, isn't it? You've got Triceratopses with pulse laser turrets, you've got ginormous raptor things, and Eldar wielding, I don't even know what that is supposed to be, an enormous sniper rifle, a lance perhaps? And you've got a Brontosaurus-looking bastard in the background with an entire house built on its back. That is just cool. But sadly, Games Workshop haven't really done all that much with the idea of these feral dinosaur-riding Eldar, which is a real lost opportunity. Games Workshop has always shied away far too much from the idea of doing variant armies, in my opinion, but oh well, that's a complaint for another day. The in-lore reason for why there are Eldar Exodites is, well, I wasn't joking when I said return to monkey, as there were elements in Eldar society during the heydays of the great Eldar Empire that were not particularly fond of the direction in which the wider empire was headed. You know, endless orgies in dank cellars whilst bathing in wine and all that. And if that was, in fact, all it was, then mayhaps it wouldn't have been so bad. If it was just the usual day-to-day excessive horniness of a species of near-immortal space elves, then, you know, who doesn't enjoy a good gangbang, I suppose? But what was more concerning to the forefathers of the Exodites was the psychological scars that were beginning to form on the collective Eldar psyche. As it wasn't merely just excess to fulfill desires, but excess for excess sake. The Eldar species was beginning to turn towards the worship of perversion. And that word, that accusation, worship, was spot on the money. The more progressive and liberal elements, I suppose we could call them, of Eldar society weren't engaging in the acts of snorting cocaine off one another's penises just because they've developed a certain penchant for it. There was a wider agenda at work here, as the Eldar Empire had been corrupted by the forces of chaos. And through that influence, the Eldar Empire was moving inexorably towards its own end, its own self-sacrifice, in the name of She Who Thirsts, Slaanesh. Now, whether or not the Exodites and their pseudo-kin, the Craft World Eldar, were ever truly aware of how bad things actually were, or whether or not they merely objected to the new adventurous lifestyle of their peers, is a bit unclear. In all due likelihood, it was some sort of a mix between the two. They objected on a moral and ethical level, and there were also those amongst them with a gift of foresight who could really start seeing the writing on the wall. Bearing in mind as well that the Eldar knew a hell of a lot more about how to manipulate the warp than humanity does, as they were the Old One's favored protégés. They had already figured out how to create warp tools and how to use the gods, quote-unquote, for their own designs. And so many of their more leading warptologists, I suppose we could dub them, would undoubtedly be able to tell that if all of this energy of this particular type began flooding into the warp in ever greater quantities, then the result would be spectacular. And, indeed, it was. But before the collapse, many of those who would since become Exodites elected to leave the Eldar Empire, giving themselves essentially a form of self-imposed exile. Though the term doesn't quite ring true, fitting considering they consider themselves the Exodites, but it's more along the lines of voluntary segregation rather than exile, because it wasn't that they were banished, although some undoubtedly were, as Eldar society at the time was entirely overrun by perversions, and so many of them would have been, well, they would have been mocked for their seemingly backwards puritanical ideas, and many of them would undoubtedly have fallen afoul of whatever legal system existed at the time, as it undoubtedly would have been as corrupt as the rest of Eldar society. But when I was half-jokingly referring to the Exodites as the Amish of the Eldar, it's not an entirely incorrect description, since they essentially decided to leave society at large and begin living life instead in accordance with their own values and belief systems. And there are even certain similarities shared between the two groups there as well. The Amish consider such things as hard work to be inherently good, or, I suppose, godly, to be a more apt term considering the subject matter at hand. The Exodites, too, when they elected to leave the Eldar Empire, deliberately sought out harsh and feral worlds, where making a living would not be at all that easy, because they figured that this, needing to actually work for a living, would keep them away from the countless degenerative excesses of the Eldar Empire. That is not to say, however, that they rejected all technology, or rejected everything that had to do with the Eldar way of life. Oh, not at all, because, again, T-Rexes with laser cannons. You'd be hard-pressed to manufacture prism weaponry using Stone Age technology. Instead of simply rejecting the technology that their forefathers had, the Exodites instead impose certain rules upon themselves, shall we say. For example, their weaponry tends to be rather sophisticated. Not in comparison to the Eldar at the height of their power, sure, but compared to a human level, for example, oh yeah, no, it is absolutely supremely high-tech nonsense. But this is used primarily in their own defense, and making sure that the various hostile species of the galaxy don't get too touchy with their planets. Whereas their actual lifestyle tends to be far more agrarian in nature, or even straight up migratory, where they live off herding animals from one area to another, or even creating multiple settlements which they live in for parts of the year before moving on to the next one. Undoubtedly, these migratory patterns would also be worked into their way of life. When they go to one area, for example, they might grow wheat, just to take a off-the-wall example. And during this period, they are fairly placid, very nice and peaceful. They go about all of the peaceful logistical concerns of the community, repairing tents, feeding their animals, raising young, yada yada yada. And then during the winter, they might move on to a more herd mentality, where they drive their animals up into hills or mountains where they can grass and dig in the snow for roots, etc. And during this period, they might embrace a more aggressive nature. As in many of the cases on Exodite worlds, the Exodites are not, almost never in fact, a single massive unified tribe. Instead, there tends to be quite a few that also compete with one another. This undoubtedly is also by choice, as the original Exodites could very easily have created an overall social system for all of them to live within. There would have been no real reason to create clan-like structures like the ones they have today, unless they chose to do so, as they could easily have created a planetary government. After all, they were still Eldar at the time, at the height of their power as well. And again, they elected to leave that empire specifically because they wanted to live in a very different way. And so it makes sense that the clan structure is another deliberate choice. And of course, this opens up the possibility for good old-fashioned violence and conflict, key construction components of any advanced and successful species. I shit you not. Like, literally. War is humanity's single greatest invention. Screw math or arts or philosophy or any of that garbage. All of it exists solely because at one point our ancestors decided to all grab clubs and go beat to death the other people living over there in the more fertile valley. Of course, large-scale conflict can and usually is rather devastating, but it was only up until very recently that we started killing each other with such efficiency as to begin outstripping our birth rate. Up until that point when, we started using gas and machine guns and artillery, etc., warfare was actually pretty goddamn healthy for human civilization, as it gave us the constant need to improve ourselves, to build bigger walls, to develop the architectural knowledge to build those walls, to figure out better metalworking designs, to figure out better metals, stronger and more flexible steel, to figure out mechanisms with which to build ships of war or catapults, to build up the organizational structure, to create vast logistical trains to support armies, or build roads to facilitate their movements. Every single, damn near anyways, invention in human society can at some point be either directly tied back to a military need or be seen used in a military need. Art, for example, the drawing of maps, philosophy, the creation of a warrior culture, math, the figuring out of how much torque is required to send a giant rock from that catapult to those people over there, etc., etc. And I know we're deviating ever so slightly from the topic of dinosaur-riding space elves here, but you can see an excellent microcosmos of the difference that conflict makes when you compare Europe to China, for example. China came up with so many innovations way before we Europeans did. They figured out blast furnaces and gunpowder way before we did, and yet Europe would eventually outpace China to a ludicrous degree, to the point that when the Europeans started showing up in China in large numbers, it was aboard vessels made of iron, capable of firing high explosive rounds for kilometers, whilst the Chinese were there with, literally, spears and crude gunpowder weaponry. And a lot of the reason for this was because of the extraordinarily high and dense concentration of large-scale warfare and violence in Europe, compared to the vast areas of China and the relative long periods of stability that China enjoyed. Interrupted occasionally by large-scale warfare too, mind you, no doubt about it, but even it tended to be more along the lines of civil wars between various Chinese dynasties, rather than the far more nationalistic warfare of Europe. I'm not explaining myself as well as I could, because frankly, this is a whole bloody historical video that I'll get to at some point in time, but anywho, returning to the laser dinosaurs in space. The various Exodite tribes carry out not warfare necessarily with one another, and I hesitate to use the word warfare because they're not trying to conquer one another. They're not trying to necessarily even lay claim to vast swaths of lands, or enslave one another, or exterminate one another. They view warfare more in kind of the same light and spirit as the Plains Indians of America, where it was, well, almost a sporting event, a bloody one to be sure, but it was something that they simply did and engaged in, and there was no necessarily overarching motivation in terms of conquest. It is difficult to explain, but let me return to the Indian example, because we have an example of this in our history. The various Plains Indian tribes were rather aggressive, and they would conduct little raids on one another, and attempts of thefts on goods and wares, and even occasionally tribes members. And these were not viewed as, well, theft as we would view it. They were not viewed as acts of aggression in the same way that we would think of it. It was seen as something that tribes simply did. It was something that young people simply did to prepare themselves for life and fighting. Of course, when the Europeans eventually arrived, they didn't see the humor in it in quite the same way. And many of these games were also, as mentioned, exceptionally violent and savage. It was simply that it was viewed in a completely different light. And the same for the Exodites. Oh, they might kill each other, they might kill a lot of one another, but once the fighting is over, they don't really hold a grudge. They can encounter one another, engage in large-scale skirmishes, dozens of deaths on each side, but after it's all done, if they then encounter one another again somewhere else during another period where warfare is not customary, for example, they will meet and they will greet one another and they will trade. And when the local ruler of the planet, for there is a ruler, sort of in most cases at least, the de facto king of the planet, asks all of the tribes to come together to defend against an external enemy, for example, then they will do so again without any rancor or internal division. There is rivalry, sure, competitive streaks between tribes or even individuals, but again, it is far more localized and not on the national scale or tribal scale in this case, I suppose. That does not, however, mean that they are incapable of engaging in large-scale warfare, because the 41st millennium is a hostile one, and a prime world filled with a seemingly savage population, well, you'd think that'd be a damn tempting target for many, many, many species out there in the galaxy, particularly for one group of individuals: Chaos and the servants of Slaanesh. For to she who thirsts there is no greater bounty, no sweeter morsel than the soul of an Eldar. Whether it be an Exodite or a Dark Eldar or a Craftworld Eldar, frankly that doesn't really matter to Slaanesh. And so you would think that relatively primitive tribal societies on relatively poorly defended Exodite worlds would be unfathomably tempting target for Slaaneshi champions with ambitions all of their very own, perhaps of demonhood, because if they can reap a few thousand Eldar souls, well, that will go a very long way indeed to earning her favor. And so obviously there exists a need for the Exodites to be able to defend themselves. Another big reason why they kept all of their guns, I imagine. They do also have a great deal of natural allies in the form of the Craftworld Eldar, who usually view the Exodites in a very positive light. They kind of view them as a exemplar to be followed, a idealized future, not necessarily past, perhaps, maybe even, although some Eldar very much so do view the Exodites as the potential seedlings of a reforged and restarted Eldar empire, and so will often go very far out of their way indeed to make sure that they can defend their Exodite brethren. Although, okay, on this topic of the, Eldar, the other Eldar, this is where we run into a little bit of a plot hole, you see, because, as I'm sure you all know, the reason why Eldar souls don't get, thrown directly to She Who Thirsts whenever they die, like all other souls end up in the warp and the materium, is because of the Infinity Circuit, and those fancy little soul stones they have. So when an Eldar die, his soul doesn't actually get transferred into the warp, the materium, but rather gets captured within the Eldar Craftworld's Infinity Circuit, with each Craftworld having its own Infinity Circuit, protecting the soul against the Nesh. Okay, fair enough. How the hell do the Exodites deal with this? Because they don't have a Craftworld, and so they don't have an Infinity Circuit. So do all of their souls just go spiraling off to Slaanesh every time they die? Because if so, wow, getting born an Exodite really, really sucks. Because again, a normal human soul in the warp is merely torn apart and destroyed. It's gonna be shitty for a while, but then you'll die. But for an Eldar soul, well, you'll be Slaaneshi's Tootsie Pop for the next 10,000 years. Hardly worth the initial period of life, frankly, if you ask me. But GW invented a little bit of a roundabout solution to this problem by introducing the World Spirit. Yes. And this is in turn essentially the Infinity Circuit for savages. Which is kind of the problem, because the Infinity Circuit wasn't something that just simply existed. The Eldar turned on or something, because suddenly they were like, oh, well, you see, we are currently in danger of having our immortal souls being eaten by a demon mummy, and so we gotta activate this ancient piece of technology designed for just this occasion. No, the Infinity Circuit was created in response to a specific problem: being eaten by demons. Which, again, to be fair, is a rather pressing concern, so I imagine the Exodites might have been trying to figure out solutions themselves. But this thing was literally, well, not necessarily invented, but created based upon ancient Eldar technology discovered on their core worlds, the Crone worlds at the heart of their empire. And this technology wasn't discovered until like the 33rd millennia from the human calendar. Something like 3,000 odd years after the fall. And obviously the Eldar wouldn't have just been like, oh yes, no, let's feed ourselves to Slaanesh in the meantime. Obviously they would have been desperately trying to find some way to avoid it. And if the far more technologically advanced Eldar required 3 millennia to figure it out, and access to technology found on the Crone worlds, it seems remarkably unreasonable for the Exodites, with their far more crude level of technology, to have come up with an equal, and indeed potentially even superior solution to their craft world dwelling descendants. Especially as the Exodite solution literally uses rocks and trees to power itself. Not even ancient mysterious wraithbone. Nope, just rocks with pretty carved patterns. Now, to be fair, they're supposed to be psychoactive crystals, but it is awfully convenient that all of these Exodites worlds just happen to have just the right kind of psychoactive crystals on them. It's one of those solutions where it just doesn't make any sense for the Exodites to have figured this out. Now, if you told me that the craft worlds had then come on later and told the Exodites, hey, when you die, your soul gets eaten by Satan, the female Satan specifically. So if you want to avoid that, we're gonna need to teach you some basic nonsense, and we'll do it with, local source material or whatever, but we've got to set up a network of pathways and stone obelisks, etc., to protect you against this. That would be fine. But the idea that the Exodites either A, figured all of this out themselves, or B, knew what was coming, protected themselves, and then looked up at their spaceborne brethren and went, bitches. And that was it. It's either way, it makes the Exodites either retarded or actively malicious. Plus, I would kind of like the idea of them being, the Eldar closest to salvation, in a way, in that they are the Eldar who have a home, a planet. They might be the seeds of a new Eldar empire, and yet also they are unknowingly doomed to torturous oblivion after they die, and they have no idea about any of this. That would be interesting, and certainly very 40k, in that these, the most, the brightest lights of the Eldar Empire, exist for no other reason than to be de facto snacks for she who thirsts. Though, I suppose that they would probably have figured it out fairly quickly, because to return a little bit to the idea of their weaponry in terms of how they can defend themselves, because again, surely if they're just using Stone Age tech, they'd be rather easy to conquer, right? Well, they have made several exceptions to their humble lifestyle rules when it comes to armament, meaning that their basic infantry weapon is still the shuriken rifle, just like the Craft World equivalent. And by and large, they have everything that the Craft Worlds would have, all the way up to even prism weaponry, the stuff usually mounted on fire prism anti-gravitanks. But the mounts for the weapons tend to be far more savage in nature, or lizard specifically, I suppose, as they mount them on, well, Triceratopters and Brontosauruses and enormous raptors. Quite literally, they are just human dinosaurs. Even Petrodactyls, apparently, can carry weapon systems for the Exodites. They do also, however, have a bit more of a focus on close-quarters combat, in that they have special elite units called the Dragon Knights. Apparently, these are a relatively common thing amongst the Exodites, even on various different planets, suggesting again that there was some sort of initial founding reason for why they wanted an elite warrior caste that needed to bond very closely with their chosen mounts, whom, as the name suggests, are dragons. Well, land dragons. They use both the petrodactyls, triceratopses, and the enormous raptor-like looking things as well as combat mounts. Undoubtedly, they will train them to attack as well, although, to be fair, a literal animal's claws are not going to be much used against, well, most things in the 41st millennium, unless they're those kind of claws, the plot armor kind of claws, like the Tyranids' claws were capable of ripping through Terminator armor like it's tissue paper. Yeah. And of course, the Riders too will be wielding a variety of high-tech weaponry, which will be able to defeat pretty much any armor that any adversary will be able to bring to bear against them. Even so, however, I very much so doubt that the Exodites would be able to carry out much of a stand-and-fight campaign. Because, at the end of the day, no matter how good a mount a raptor might be, well, I imagine it's not a very logistically friendly mount. How many kilos of meat is an enormous raptor going to need every day? How many pack animals are you going to need to carry all of that? What kind of pack animals? How much feed are they going to need? What is their top speed? Could it be compared to a, truck or anything? Probably not. Do they have artillery? Maybe, but not a whole lot unlikely, and if they do have it, it's going to be mounted on something large, slow, and squishy, and extraordinarily vulnerable to cluster munitions. Basically, the point is, the Exodites are probably not going to want to be engaging in large-scale pitched combat. They are not suited for it, nor, in all due likelihood, do they have the numbers. If their society is based around base-level agriculture and herding hordes of animals, etc., then they are not going to be able to support all that large of a population, especially if they also engage in recreational warfare with one another. If they don't have central governance or massive agriculture, their populations are going to be numbering in the millions, certainly. Billions? Unlikely. The thing is, you need to produce a lot of food to support a civilization of that size. And not just food. You need shelter, you need security, you need all of the things that actually allow people to stay alive for a long period of time. Now, that is going to be easier for the Eldar, I suppose, presuming they've kept a lot of their higher-level medical technology, but even then, the sheer amount of produce you need to serve a population in the billions is absurd, and would require a massive industrial base. For comparison, we humans only reached the 1 billion mark somewhere around the early 1900s or so, and then our population absolutely skyrocketed along with the Industrial Revolution. And since the Exodites do not seem to be having, sprawling factories, I would be very surprised if their population on the average Exodite world numbered in even a single billion. This would in turn also, of course, very much so limit their ability to wage a large-scale war against a major alien invader. In fact, besides their extraordinarily advanced technology and the aid from passing craft worlds, the Exodites are very, very, very exposed, and their continued survival relies more on nobody knowing that they're there rather than being able to actually defend themselves against outside threats. If a Tyranid splinter fleet, for example, showed up, they are dead meat. If a Orc Warg passed by, again, dead meat. If a Necron tomb world opened up nearby, again, dead meat. If the Imperium discovered them, they'd probably be dead meat, only shielded by the fact that the Imperium might look at them and go, well, they're not going anywhere, so I guess we don't need to bother. And hey, I might have inadvertently made a very good argument for why GW shouldn't bother making the Exodites into more of a thing of their own and more of a real faction, because they'd probably be wiped out almost immediately. Though I would still like to see stuff like Exodite mercenary companies be used by craft worlds, for example. That'd be awesome. Give them rules similar to a la the Rough Riders of the Imperial Guard, for example, except obviously with dinosaur mounts. Or give them special fire prism rules where it's a Brontosaurus and you give it, I don't know, less toughness or something, but it's cheaper. That'd be funny. A variant army list with different interpretations on commonly used Eldar weaponry. That could be cool, but relatively unlikely to happen, as it would mean a fair bit of work for Games Workshop, something they are not necessarily particularly fond of. And that about wraps it up. The Eldar Exodite. Savage little space elves that live in harmony with nature, at least to the point where they manage to entrap their souls within the very planet itself using a network of psychoreactive crystals, even as they engage in constant low-scale tribal warfare with one another, whilst praying that the wider galaxy does not take an interest in squashing their hovels. It's certainly a way to live. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.